What would you do if you had everything you ever dreamed of? The mansion, the cars, the vacations, the love story everyone envied, and then, in a single moment, realized it was all built on a contract designed to protect the other person, not you? Imagine being married into wealth and power, living in luxury you never thought you'd touch, and then one day being told that when it ends, you walk away with nothing. That's the nightmare our main character faced. And instead of accepting it, she made one fateful decision: to beat the system. But what she didn't realize was that when you play games with contracts and lawyers, the house almost always wins. And in this case, her greed didn't just leave her empty-handed, it destroyed her in a way she never saw coming. When she first met him, he seemed like every woman's dream. Tall, polished, successful beyond belief, and with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from already winning at life. He wasn't just wealthy, he was powerful. He had built a company from the ground up, turning it into a multi-million-dollar empire. She had grown up in a very different world. A modest life, always on the outside looking in, wanting more than what her parents could ever afford. When he noticed her, it felt like a dream. Suddenly, she was whisked into a lifestyle she had only ever seen in magazines. Luxury trips to Europe. 5-star restaurants on a random Tuesday. Designer clothes, not because she needed them, but because he wanted her to look like the woman on his arm deserved to look. She wasn't blind to the reality. She knew he had money. And she knew being with him meant access to a world she never could have reached on her own. But she also told herself it was love. And maybe in the beginning it was, but then came the prenup. Before they married, he sat her down with his lawyer. The contract was thick, full of legal jargon she didn't fully understand, but its meaning was simple. If the marriage ended, she would leave with nothing. No mansion, no alimony. No slice of the empire he had built. At first she was offended. She cried, asked him why he didn't trust her, why he was treating her like a stranger and not a future wife. But he was calm, almost cold. He had worked his whole life for what he had, and he wasn't about to risk losing half of it to someone who hadn't been there from the start. The choice was clear: sign the prenup, or there would be no wedding. She signed. And in that moment, whether she realized it or not, the stage was set for the war that would eventually destroy her. For a while, life was perfect. She played the role of the elegant wife, the woman who threw charity dinners, who smiled for the cameras, who spent afternoons shopping while her husband closed million-dollar deals. But beneath the glamour, cracks began to show. He was busy, often gone, and when he was home, his attention was split between her and the empire he was still expanding. She began to feel like an accessory, important enough to display, but never the center of his world. That's when the resentment began. And resentment mixed with luxury is a dangerous cocktail. The more she thought about it, the angrier she became. Why should she live this life, play this role, and then one day, if things ended, walk away with nothing? She had gotten used to wealth, to status, to the idea of being untouchable. She told herself she deserved more, half at least. And slowly, a plan began to take shape in her mind. The fights started small. Arguments over his late nights at the office. Accusations that he didn't care about her anymore. He brushed them off, tried to smooth things over with gifts, but the truth was, the marriage was already unraveling. The prenup that once seemed like a small inconvenience had turned into a chain around her neck. Every time she thought about divorce, she saw her life shrink. No mansion, no luxury, no safety net, just emptiness, and that was when she made her choice. She wouldn't let the contract win. She wouldn't walk away with nothing. If her husband thought that prenup could protect him, he was about to find out just how wrong he was. By the time she decided she wanted out, the resentment had already hardened into something darker: determination. She was done being the perfect wife, done smiling for cameras, done waiting around while her husband built the kingdom that she would never truly own a part of. The prenup was her biggest obstacle. It spelled out, in black and white, that she would walk away with nothing. But in her mind, contracts were just paper. Paper could be twisted, bent, even broken if you knew where to push. She convinced herself she was smarter than the lawyers who had drafted it, smarter than her husband who had insisted on it, smarter than the system itself. And so the game began. She started small. She began documenting every fight, every cold shoulder, every late night when he didn't come home. She twisted ordinary arguments into evidence of emotional neglect. She told friends and later her own attorney that her husband was controlling, unfaithful, abusive even. Was any of it true? Not really. But truth was no longer her concern. Winning was. She believed if she could paint herself as a victim, the prenup could be challenged. She scoured online forums, whispered with divorce lawyers over coffee, and studied stories of women who had walked away from ironclad contracts with millions in hand. The more she read, the more she believed she could do the same. At home, she perfected her performance. She would pick fights, then record his frustrated responses on her phone, cutting clips until they sounded harsher than they really were. She staged photos of herself looking miserable, sent texts to friends about how toxic her marriage was, and saved screenshots of arguments that painted her as the victim. Every move was calculated. Every tear rehearsed. She was building a narrative, one brick at a time, to present before a court that would, she believed, feel sorry for her. The irony, her husband hardly noticed. He was so buried in his business that he didn't realize the woman beside him was no longer his wife. She was his opponent. When she finally filed for divorce, she didn't come quietly. She came swinging. Her legal team presented the case like a Hollywood drama. She was the innocent wife, neglected, mistreated, manipulated by a cold husband who had locked her into a cruel prenup. They argued that the contract was unfair, that she had been pressured into signing it, that she hadn't understood what she was giving up. Her husband was blindsided. For all his success in business, he hadn't expected betrayal in his own home. But if she thought he was going to roll over, she had miscalculated. The courtroom became a battlefield. On her side, sob stories, manipulated evidence, and a carefully crafted performance. On his side, a team of lawyers who had drafted that prenup like a fortress, impenetrable and airtight. Her lawyers argued coercion. His lawyers countered with proof she had independent counsel when she signed. They argued ignorance. He produced emails where she had discussed the prenup terms in detail before the wedding. They argued abuse. He showed receipts of luxury vacations, expensive gifts, and charity galas where she smiled for cameras, hardly the picture of a trapped victim. The harder she pushed, the more her case crumbled. The turning point came when her husband's legal team began to dig into her own actions. They found the recordings she had made, heavily edited. They uncovered text messages to her friends where she bragged about finding a way to break the prenup. They even traced consultations she had with divorce attorneys years earlier while still enjoying the perks of married life. It was clear she hadn't been forced, manipulated, or blind. She had been calculating, planning, and waiting for her moment. And the court saw right through it. Piece by piece, her case collapsed. What was supposed to be her grand escape with millions turned into a humiliating defeat. The judge upheld the prenup in its entirety. The contract was valid, fair, and unbreakable. Instead of winning half his empire, she got exactly what she signed for years earlier: nothing. No mansion, no alimony. No slice of the fortune she had tasted for so long. And worse, the lies she had told, the manipulation she had orchestrated, had been exposed in front of everyone, her friends, her family, her community. She didn't just lose the money, she lost her reputation. Walking out of the courtroom, she was no longer the glamorous wife draped in diamonds. She was a woman with nothing but a handbag, staring at the world that had once been hers and realizing she had gambled it away. She had tried to outsmart the system, but in the end the system had outsmarted her. And the man she thought she could bleed dry? He walked away untouched, his empire secure, his legacy unshaken, but she wasn't done paying the price yet. Because sometimes losing in court is only the beginning of the consequences. The courtroom defeat should have been the end, but in truth, it was just the beginning. Walking out that day, she thought maybe she could salvage something, maybe friends would still sympathize, maybe she could spin the story to make herself look like the wounded victim. But reality hit fast and hard. Her friends, the ones she thought she could count on, began to distance themselves. No one wanted to be associated with scandal. The charities that once invited her to galas quietly removed her from their guest lists. Even the luxury boutiques where she had spent hours shopping treated her like just another customer, no longer someone important. The glamorous life she had built around her husband's wealth vanished almost overnight. And then came the harshest truth of all: she had nothing. The prenup she once brushed aside as just a piece of paper was now ironclad reality: no mansion, no car, no savings. Even the credit cards she had once swiped without thinking were cut off. For the first time in years, she was forced to think about basics: rent, bills, groceries. It was a shock to her system, a system that had grown used to private jets and champagne weekends. She scrambled for work, but what kind of job could a woman with her history and reputation get? Employers Googled her name and immediately saw the story of the divorce, the courtroom humiliation, the lies. The prenup hadn't just left her with nothing. It had stripped away her future, too. What made it worse was the way people looked at her. Friends who once hung on her every word now whispered behind her back. Old acquaintances crossed the street to avoid her. She had spent years cultivating an image of wealth and power, but now that image worked against her. No one saw her as a woman starting over. They saw her as a cautionary tale, the woman who tried to cheat her way into fortune and failed spectacularly. Her ex-husband, meanwhile, hardly seemed touched by any of it. He went back to work, back to building his empire, barely acknowledging the storm she had tried to create. If anything, the ordeal made him stronger. The prenup had done exactly what it was designed to do: protect him. And in a way, that might have been the cruelest punishment of all for her. He lost nothing. She lost everything. Late at night, in the quiet of an apartment she could barely afford, she thought about the choices she made. She thought about the pen in her hand on the day she signed that prenup, telling herself it didn't matter, that she'd never need to worry about it. She thought about the moment she chose lies over honesty, manipulation over integrity. And the bitter truth sank in: she had destroyed herself. She could have left with dignity. She could have accepted the prenup and walked away to rebuild a simpler life. Maybe even kept some of her friends, her reputation, her peace of mind. But greed wouldn't let her. The thought of nothing scared her so much that she gambled everything and lost more than she ever imagined. Divorce isn't easy for anyone, but in her case it wasn't just the end of a marriage. It was the exposure of who she really was when stripped of wealth and luxury. The court had seen it, the public had seen it, and now she had to live with it. Her ex-husband's name remained untarnished, his business thriving. He even became something of an example in financial circles, a man who had protected his assets wisely and proven the power of a solid prenup. She, on the other hand, was remembered not as the glamorous wife she once pretended to be, but as the woman who tried to cheat the system and ended up with less than nothing. Months turned into years, and the world moved on. But she couldn't escape the shadow of her own choices. The scandal followed her, whispered in every room she entered. Dates ended the moment her past came up. Jobs slipped through her fingers once her name was Googled. Her life became smaller, dimmer, quieter. And in that silence, the lesson became impossible to ignore. Greed doesn't just cost you money, it costs you trust. It costs you relationships, it costs you respect. And once those things are gone, no amount of wealth could ever buy them back. In the end, the story wasn't about a prenup or a courtroom. It was about a simple truth: you can't build a life on lies and expect it to stand. She tried to outsmart the system, outmaneuver her husband, outplay the lawyers. But every move she made was fueled by greed, not love, not fairness, not honesty. And greed always has a price. For her, that price was everything. For him, the lesson was clear. He had been right to protect what he built. The empire stood tall. The legacy endured. And the woman who thought she could take it all was left with nothing but regret. Because in the end, the contract didn't ruin her life. Her own choices did.